MacIntyre will emphasize that one symptom of our moral confusion is the complete inability of anyone to win a moral argument. Instead, he observes that we typically resort to manipulation and expressions of emotion. And he thinks, therefore, protest is the paradigmatic mode of moral discourse today. So are we completely confused about morality? Howdy, Dr. Reed here at The Political Animal, and today I'd like for you to imagine with me a crazy scenario. So today's going to be just like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. I want you to join me in make-believe land. And what we're going to make believe is that perhaps in our culture today, and you're really going to have to use your imagination for this. When we talk about morality and politics and values, we are just utterly confused. Not just that there are utterly confused people today talking about these things. No. That's not nearly wild enough. No. Imagine that our evaluative discourse itself, the way we think and talk about values, is hopelessly confused. Imagine our vocabulary and grammar for values are confused. Okay, you still with me? Imagine it is so bad that even if some of us have moral insight, we just can't articulate it as part of a coherent evaluative picture of the world. We're going to imagine this world in make-believe land today. This wild scenario is in fact the main thesis of the philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre in his book After Virtue. Okay. In this video, we're going to unpack that thesis and see if we can understand what MacIntyre is trying to tell us. Now, I have to note, I've been teaching this book to college students for many years. And the first time was in the early 2010s, and most recently this past semester. And I have to tell you, college students are getting better and better at imagining this scenario lately. And I can't explain that. I can't explain why that is. But it seems that the imaginative powers of college students to imagine this fantastical situation where we live in an utterly morally confused society, it's really improved the past few years. I guess we'll never know why. Now, what'll really blow your mind is that MacIntyre imagined this scenario all the way back in 1981, or whenever he first started writing this book. So he must have been really good at make-believe. Now, of course, MacIntyre thought he could see the confusion unfolding in real time. MacIntyre will emphasize that one symptom of our moral confusion is the complete inability of anyone to win a moral argument. Instead, he observes that we typically resort to manipulation and expressions of emotion. And he thinks, therefore, protest is the paradigmatic mode of moral discourse today. Now, protest doesn't try and win an argument, right? It expresses emotion. It is a mode of coercion. It reveals no truth, and it only expresses a will. So we end up with warring sides politically, expressing contrary wills. And if you're looking for truth, you're not going to find it that way. So what's going on with moral discourse? Well, MacIntyre begins by telling us a parable drawn from the plot of a sci-fi novel, Canticle for Leibowitz. And in this book, The Canticle for Leibowitz, the basic premise is science has suffered a catastrophe. A long time ago, science was humming along just fine, making all kinds of advancements, but they alienated the public, right? A nuclear war devastates the planet, and people around the world blame scientists for developing nuclear technology. So thinking that science is dangerous, that the world's better off without it, a mass movement mobilizes against the practice of science. It gets ugly. Scientists are hunted down, killed in mass, labs are destroyed, and all the books containing scientific knowledge are publicly burned. Every attempt is made to wipe the last trace of science from the planet. And so, during this purge, perhaps even before the last scientist is killed or dies of old age hiding somewhere in a cave, the practice of science ceases. Not only is there no ongoing research, but the initiation of new scientists into the practice of science ends. Science dies out. But of course, as you can imagine, perhaps within a century, society changes its mind. Right? There's still some cultural memory of science being pretty useful. Science brought along some really neat stuff, and people think they'd kind of like to get that back. But how? Right? How? There are no living scientists, and there is no current practice of science. So the people sift through the ashes, searching for relics of the past scientific age. The purge wasn't complete. Here and there, fragments of the old science survive. There are many pages from important books like Newton's Principia. There's bits of encyclopedia articles on Einstein. And here and there, one can find bits of chapters on scientific theories. There's even a partial reconstruction of the periodic table. And over centuries, this new generation of aspiring scientists, they recover a lot of the scientific vocabulary from the past, and they start using it. Now, while these people use the same vocabulary as the previous generation of real scientists, they don't use scientific terms the same way or even with the same meaning and certainly not the same understanding. The context of science has been lost, okay? And it was the theories that gave that vocabulary meaning. And they're either gone altogether or they exist in only fragmentary form. The practice of science in laboratories and scholarly debate in scientific journals, it's all gone. Thus, while it might be that a substantial amount of the scientific vocabulary is now in use with this later generation, whatever it is the speakers are doing with this vocabulary, it's not science. The language of science is in great disorder, and this later generation of would-be scientists are a generation of disordered speakers. So this is the basic parable, but I want to make sure we understand exactly what's happening, the point MacIntyre's making. You might be a little confused and wonder, well, why is recovering scientific vocabulary not enough for talking intelligibly about science? I mean, if we have part of the periodic table, doesn't that mean we can talk intelligibly about the elements listed? I mean, if we still have the part of the table that has helium, I mean, can't we still talk about helium intelligibly? Well, not in this scenario, okay? Um, the knowledge of helium recovered by this, disorder generation of would-be scientists, it's so fragmentary as to be useless. The theory of nature that underlies the 20th century periodic table is gone. There's no conception of subatomic particles, so the numbers and arrangements on the table mean nothing to these people. None of them has ever observed helium in a laboratory setting. They don't even know that it's a gas under normal conditions. So by the standards of actual science, it's doubtful anyone in this disorder generation has a real conception of what helium or an element is. And this is demonstrated by the fact that they happily try and combine pieces of incompatible theories from the history of science. So look at the periodic table. The periodic table is the product of modern chemistry, and its modern organization and underlying theory of chemistry superseded, replaced older attempts to understand chemical phenomena. For example, before the role of oxygen in combustion was identified, previous theories postulated phlogiston as what combustion released. Well, phlogiston was postulated solely to explain combustion. And so once combustion is better explained by oxidation, the concept of phlogiston is revealed to be empty. There's nothing out there that does what previous scientists thought that phlogiston did. However, this disordered generation doesn't grasp that phlogiston belongs to a failed theory that the periodic table replaced. And so they're out here trying to figure out where phlogiston fits on the periodic table. And furthermore, apart from any practice of experimentation in a lab, these people can endlessly speculate and imagine things about the elements that no practicing scientist could believe. Within the practice of actual science, the practice of experimentation constrains belief, speculation, and talk about these topics. However, this late generation has no practice by which to test or confirm claims. Thus, one feature of the disordered generation is that when they use scientific vocabulary, they're able to speculate in wildly different directions, come into great disagreement with one another, and as they lack any practice of experimentation, they cannot rationally resolve any of their disagreements. So, big picture, here's where things stand in this scenario. Remember, we're still in make believe land. So, first, although scientific vocabulary has been recovered, the practice of science and the beliefs and theories presupposed by the vocabulary is gone. Second, the use of scientific vocabulary appears arbitrary and lacking any clear and consistent meaning. Completely unmoored from the theories that gave them meaning, the use of the terms is senseless. And so, third, scientific debates would all appear to be completely unresolvable. Opposing theories would seem to just argue from incommensurable premises without any rational way to determine whose premises are even correct. And finally, fourth, philosophers who come across this situation would posit subjective theories of science, arguing that the inability to reach rational agreement in science is an essential feature of science. That is, they would think science is subjective and only ever could be. That is, they would mistake a peculiar feature of their historical situation for the essential nature of scientific discourse. MacIntyre's disquieting suggestion. MacIntyre's disquieting suggestion is the current state of moral discourse is like that of science in the parable. So first, we possess only the fragments of an earlier coherent moral conceptual scheme. Second, while we use the moral vocabulary of this past conceptual scheme, we do so only in a disordered way. Moral terms have lost their original significance because, one, moral terms are being used apart from the moral practice, and two, the theory that gave them meaning. And so it follows that our practice of morality is, in an important sense, only a parody of the real practice of morality. And finally, we see that moral arguments are incapable of rational resolution. We recognize that those who disagree on a moral issue begin from incompatible premises, but we don't have any theory or practice for determining whose premises are correct. And so we therefore assume that the premises can only be accepted arbitrarily. Thus, we conclude that moral commitments are ultimately subjective. We don't realize the premises of each side are rooted in a larger whole. And if we grasp that larger whole, then we could likely resolve a lot more moral questions. We don't recognize our situation at all. Rather than realize we're missing part of a larger picture that does have the resources to resolve moral debates, we think we have the complete picture of morality as is, and so instead conclude that morality is essentially the way we find it, that is essentially not capable of rational agreement. Hence, it must be essentially subjective. Now, MacIntyre recognizes that his suggestion calls into question our own self-understanding and that our instinct is going to be to reject it immediately. Think about it. In our modern society, moral arguments have tremendous power. We seem to really respect the idea of morality. Not many people want to concede that they're immoral or that their favorite political policies or candidates are immoral. And it seems that much of political debate is about precisely who has the moral high ground. So we see ourselves as a moral people or a people aspiring to be moral. To accept this would be quite humbling. And it would be an implicit admission that we lack self-knowledge and self-understanding in a critical way. So at this point, you might have some serious questions for MacIntyre about this disquieting suggestion that one, moral practice suffered a catastrophe, And two, consequently, moral discourse today is in a state of grave disorder. So you might wonder, well, first, why haven't the moral philosophers who spend their time studying morals and ethics noticed the disorder? Why haven't they pointed out that our moral discourse is disordered, right? They seem to hum along doing moral philosophy as though there's nothing wrong. Second, why do we have no historical record of such a catastrophe befalling moral practice? The history of Western civilization goes back pretty far, and it's pretty complete. We know a lot about the history of the past several centuries. Why is there no record of this great catastrophe in an otherwise largely complete historical account? And we can actually take these questions and convert them into objections if we start thinking of MacIntyre's disquieting suggestion as a hypothesis, and then thinking of these questions as actually surprising observations that undermine MacIntyre's hypothesis. So let's take a few minutes and think of MacIntyre's disquieting suggestion as a hypothesis, and then let's consider whether or not it's undermined by these observations about what philosophers and historians see or fail to see. And I think we'll see MacIntyre has a very interesting response to these kinds of objections. So let's start by just thinking about evaluating hypotheses by observations generally. So often we evaluate hypotheses by identifying the kinds of observations we should expect if the hypothesis is true versus the kinds of observations that would be surprising if the hypothesis is true. So let's start with a simple example. Suppose my dog brings a newspaper to me in the morning. And like, does this even still happen anywhere? I don't even know if there's still newspapers, but let's go with it. The newspaper's pretty wet, okay? So what explains the fact that my newspaper is wet? Well, one hypothesis that comes to mind is the hypothesis that it rained this morning. That would explain my observation that my newspaper is wet. However, that hypothesis also predicts other observations. Notice, if it truly rained early this morning, then my grass outside will be wet. And so the truth of my hypothesis would entail the truth of an observable claim, that my grass is wet. In other words, my hypothesis predicts a certain observation, the observation of grass being wet. And that means I can gather evidence to support my hypothesis by looking for this observation. So suppose I look outside my window and I see that indeed the grass is wet. So that observation ever so slightly confirms or counts in favor of my hypothesis. However, in the course of making an observation that my hypothesis did predict that my grass is wet, I make another observation, okay? I see the street is dry, right? And most of the yards of my neighbors are dry. Now, this is an observation my hypothesis did not predict. In fact, if my hypothesis is true, this is an extremely surprising observation. Okay, it would have to be the case that the rain only fell on my yard alone. All right, and that seems pretty unlikely. So I'm probably going to look for another hypothesis. Maybe I meant to turn the sprinklers off last week and I forgot. Now let's just consider how this observation undermined my initial hypothesis of rain. My hypothesis predicted some observations and not others. And in fact, some observations were extremely surprising given my hypothesis. And we can use this basic method to test hypotheses. When we consider one, we look around at the observations available and we ask, well, are these observations surprising given the truth of our hypothesis? And if so, that tends to undermine it. All right. Now, if you're interested in these kinds of questions, there's actually a substantial body of philosophical literature on these kinds of topics. It ties into Bayes' theorem, confirmation theory, and abductive inference. But let's put it to work. Okay, we're doing moral philosophy. So let's take what we just saw and let's apply it to MacIntyre's disquieting suggestion. And first, we'll call that suggestion a hypothesis. So now we can reformulate our two questions into observations. First observation. Moral philosophy proceeds as if there is no great disorder afflicting modern moral discourse. Second, Our very complete and thorough history of Western Civ doesn't record any great catastrophe befalling moral practice. Now, these observations will tend to undermine MacIntyre's hypothesis insofar as they are surprising, given the truth of his hypothesis. So, in other words, suppose the hypothesis that moral discourse is currently in a state of disorder is true. How surprising is it that we observe moral philosophers have not generally recognized the disorder? Similarly, supposing the hypothesis that moral practice suffered a great catastrophe, supposing it's true, how surprising is it that we observe that history doesn't seem to record the catastrophe? And so you might think both observations are very surprising. Surely moral philosophers would recognize such disorder if it existed, and surely historians would have documented a catastrophe on the scale of moral practice falling into disarray. MacIntyre disagrees. He thinks there's nothing surprising about these observations at all. So let's look at philosophy first. The moral philosophers don't recognize any great state of disorder, and MacIntyre thinks that's actually exactly what we should expect. In MacIntyre's parable about science, he sort of prepares for this kind of objection. He claims that philosophy of the kind practiced in the 20th century would be entirely unable to recognize that the language of science was in a condition of disorder. Now, philosophy in the 20th century belongs to two major traditions, continental and analytic. And analytic is by far the dominant kind of philosophy in the English-speaking world. So PhD programs in America, Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, they're largely analytic. Continental, not surprisingly, is the dominant kind of philosophy practiced on the European continent. So most famous French and German philosophers that you can name, but you don't know what they thought, people like Foucault, Derrida, Heidegger, they're continental. And MacIntyre argues that continental philosophy, in the form of phenomenology and existentialism, would be unable to detect that something was amiss with scientific language, because the structures of intentionality, everything would be just the same either way. My training is in analytic philosophy, so I have nothing to add to that. But when it comes to analytic philosophy, MacIntyre says that we would not recognize the situation because logical analysis would miss the disorder. And I can say a little more here. So we analytics, we pride ourselves on our use of logic. The founder of analytic philosophy was the great mathematician and logician Bertrand Russell. He played a major role in developing modern logic and set theory. And Gottlob Frege, who got predicate logic rolling, that's one of our patron saints. So we all learned predicate logic. I taught it to undergrads all throughout grad school. And I actually had to take a seminar in mathematical logic and do inductive proofs about natural numbers and things like that to get my PhD. So we're quite serious about logic and very proud of our ability to tease out logical consequences of concepts and the conditions for their applicability, right? However, this means that our philosophical work is largely downstream of the concepts we're given to work with. Well, what if we've been given bad concepts or an incomplete conceptual scheme? It's not clear we have the analytical tools to diagnose what went wrong upstream of the concepts. So no, in either case, the philosophers could only work with what the false scientists gave them. That the false scientists were practicing a parody of science would be invisible to philosophers. So insofar as analytic philosophers are dealing with incomplete or faulty moral concepts to begin with, they're unlikely to discover that their concepts are fragmentary simply by analyzing the logical consequences. And remember, in that parable about the scientific catastrophe, MacIntyre says philosophers would simply analyze the scientific concepts, note that they don't admit of rational resolution to disagreement, and postulate subjective theories of science. They'd assume they were working with a complete picture, not missing essential elements. Now, consider the fact that many moral philosophers today do posit theories of morality that take morality to ultimately originate in subjective desires and emotions. And if this were a metaethics seminar, I'd go into detail distinguishing emotivism from subjectivism and both from error theory. And I'd talk about the development of expressivism. But for our purposes today, these distinctions don't matter much. MacIntyre somewhat lazily refers to them all collectively as emotivism. And for the purposes of this video, we can do that. I'll adopt that convention. Because what matters is that at bottom, all these major theories of moral discourse take moral discourse to be ultimately rooted in subjectivity. Just as MacIntyre's hypothesis predicts philosophers would do if moral language were to be in a condition of disorder. So, no, the inability of philosophers to recognize the disorder is not surprising given MacIntyre's hypothesis. It's expected. So let's turn to history. How surprising is it, given MacIntyre's hypothesis, that history doesn't record the catastrophe? You might think that surely, if this catastrophe had really happened, it would be in recorded history, right? How could anyone ignore it? Well, MacIntyre's way ahead of you. He agrees history is going to be very valuable in identifying the catastrophe. A scenario where moral practice suffers a catastrophe leading to widespread disorder in moral discourse requires, MacIntyre says, three historical stages. One, there's the stage where the practice and language of morality is healthy and in a state of good order. Two, we have a stage of collapse, right, where the practice ceases. And then three, we have the stage of recovery, where practice returns but in a disordered form. And yet, it's hard to see anywhere that history has recorded these three stages. How could that be if MacIntyre's right? Like, surely it would have been recorded. And so you'll ask, how could the people living through the collapse fail to notice the moral practice, moral discourse was falling apart? And here, MacIntyre, he admits, his hypothesis comes to appear even more unbelievable. If he's right, it has to be that the people didn't realize or ceased to realize the nature of what was happening around them. And he has an interesting response. He says, well, look, this result is not that surprising, but exactly what we should expect. And he concedes that we have a pretty good and unbroken history of Western civ. It goes back pretty far, and there's not any clear record of the catastrophe. But he says, look, in response, first, the catastrophe need not have happened in a few sudden violent episodes, right? Manifest to everyone. It could have happened in a slow, complex process that was not easily identified from any particular vantage point in history. Second, and this is where it gets interesting, okay? He explains that history today is, of course, the academic history of the universities, right? Which is less than 2 centuries old. And if you know anything about the discipline of academic history, well, it aspires to value neutrality. Generally, 20th century social scientists and also historians observe what is called the fact-value divide. There are facts, there are values, and they're separate. There are no facts about values, and no factual academic discourse takes evaluative form. That would include history. So historians typically describe events without picking sides. If William conquers England, this will be described as neutrally as possible, right? Academic historians aren't going to beat their breast and bemoan the fall of Anglo-Saxon rule. Nor are they going to cheer and praise the rise of the French Normans. They're going to attempt to describe that transition of power in value-neutral terms. One dynasty succeeds another dynasty without morally evaluating it. And thus, from the perspective of value-neutral history, a moral catastrophe could be rendered invisible. We might hear history dispassionately narrate the succession of one value system succeeding another, but never stopping and identifying this succession as catastrophic. That would be to breach the fact-value divide. But hang on now. When did the fact-value divide become the standard of academic discourse? Okay? When did the discipline of history accept this view, right? So do you see where MacIntyre's going? And so MacIntyre has us ask ourselves, what if the catastrophe happened before the rise of academic history? And what if the aspiration to value neutrality on the part of academic history itself is one of the consequences of the catastrophe? Then modern historians could be as blind to the catastrophe as anyone else. In other words, not only does the fact-value divide blind historians to recognizing the catastrophe as a catastrophe, but the emergence of the fact-value divide itself is precisely the kind of consequence that we'd expect from a moral catastrophe. And so MacIntyre argues that not only is the failure of history to record the catastrophe not surprising, given his hypothesis, it's pretty much what we would expect. Now, 3 points about the big picture here so far. First, MacIntyre has good responses to the argument that the failure of academic history and philosophy to recognize the disordered state of moral practice and discourse is surprising given his hypothesis. Not only is it not surprising, he thinks these failures are what we should expect, given his hypothesis. But keep in mind, he's not won the argument yet. He's only diffused some objections, and only temporarily. But fortunately for MacIntyre, he has the whole rest of the book to defend his thesis. Second, and this is kind of a spoiler here, I occasionally give spoilers. Later in the book, MacIntyre shows, in fact, history did record the catastrophe, but it recorded it as progress. And if you want to understand what that catastrophe actually was and how we today tend to see it as progress, you'll have to read the book or continue watching. Third, if the book ended here on page 4, we wouldn't have much reason to take MacIntyre's hypothesis seriously. But it's only the beginning, and throughout the rest of the book, he's going to try and describe precisely those 3 historical stages. So he's going to describe the stage when the language of morality was in good working order, and then he's going to describe the collapse, and he'll describe the stage after the collapse, where the language of morality survives, but is in serious disorder. And that's where he starts, with contemporary culture. So where does MacIntyre's thesis leave us? So we understand the basic thesis. Our moral practice suffered a great catastrophe, and now the state of our moral discourse is in serious disorder. We're thoroughly confused on moral issues, and we lack a coherent moral vision. So where exactly does this leave us? Well, you should be very disquieted. A number of questions arise that might also take the form of objections. First, where is MacIntyre trying to take us? Is he some kind of radical? Second, if his thesis is correct, how deep does the moral confusion go, right? How does this not take away our basic moral convictions, such as that murder is wrong? Third, this is all true. What resources are left, or what resources can we draw upon to recover a coherent moral vision, right? Where do we look to retrieve them? All right, so let's continue our make-believe for just a little longer, and we'll see the fuller implications of MacIntyre's claim. First, on the question, is MacIntyre some kind of radical? There's a lot of that going on right now, so it's a fair question. And the answer is, frustratingly, yes and no. MacIntyre wrote this book after leaving Marxism behind. He had a career as a Marxist philosopher, and this book marks his turning over a new leaf. So at several points throughout the book, he'll point out what he sees as the shortcomings of Marxism. Now, MacIntyre explicitly compares himself to a student radical in the opening chapter. And he probably has the student radicals of the 60s and 70s in mind, but I doubt that the type has really changed that much. He could just as easily be comparing himself to the radical students occupying campuses today. MacIntyre notes that while the student radical claims to be radical, in one sense, the student radical is actually quite conservative and quite tame in another sense. That is, the radical assumes that the condition of moral discourse in this culture is in good working order. Hence, she's quite persuaded that her moral convictions are true, that they're rational, they're correct. Therefore, she's likewise confident in the coherency of the moral grammar that she uses to articulate them. Well, MacIntyre is more radical than the radical, as he denies all of this, right? The student radical is in fact quite trusting of the state of moral discourse, and so very naive, because in fact the discourse is incoherent. And ultimately, MacIntyre's prescription is radical in a very different way than the student radicals of today, precisely because of its humility. Okay, he's ultimately going to counsel this is almost kind of a spoiler, that we need to seek to recover the moral life of the small community. This is quite the opposite of establishing some kind of new global world order. Okay, so third, well, how deep does the moral confusion go? So, like if we're still playing make believe, okay, and we accept MacIntyre, we'll encounter another obstacle, okay? So, look, maybe we don't have the same confidence as the student radical, right? Uh, Maybe we're not confident we could completely order the whole world or even the whole country. But don't we obviously have some certain moral convictions, such as that it's wrong to murder, it's good to help other people, and it's necessary to keep promises, right? So how deep does MacIntyre claim the moral confusion goes? Remember the thesis. The thesis is about concepts, language, and rational discourse in a particular culture. Let's call it Western Civ. MacIntyre is denying that we as members of Western Civ share a coherent conceptual scheme so that then this is our situation. We can't reach rational agreement on moral issues. MacIntyre does not have to deny that many of us have sound, pre-theoretical moral sensibilities, like an aversion to harming others, a proclivity to cooperation, and a tendency to hold to promises and to hold to common rules of conduct, even when it's inconvenient. These are what the philosopher, another philosopher, David Wiggins, calls first order moral sensibilities. And first order moral sensibilities they're not inside you as a consequence of any theory that you've accepted. And no one really has to teach them to you, okay? If you're human, you'll possess them in a raw form by nature. But they don't furnish us with any concepts or beliefs themselves. They're more like the raw materials from which we generate moral thought, reflection, and theory. So, look, what should happen is that these sensibilities are nurtured, pruned, and cultivated through the rational guidance of your social world so that you, in your own character, refine them into a fully formed, virtuous character. So think of them as raw materials for moral character. And while they're not beliefs or conceptual in themselves, they have to be formed and shaped by a rationally coherent vision of good character and the good life. So even though the moral catastrophe did not deprive us of all these natural moral sensibilities, these sensibilities do not themselves furnish us with any concepts, much less a coherent conceptual scheme. And unrefined and apart from any comprehensive conceptual framework, these raw sensibilities can easily come into conflict with each other and leave us absolutely speechless in the face of some very mundane moral conflicts and dilemmas. Thus, our conceptual confusion means that we're deprived of the use of our uniquely human faculty of speech and reasoning with respect to the most fundamental commitments of our shared social life. When it comes to the order that governs our social life together, we're effectively mute animals. We can express emotions, we can struggle against one another, we can struggle for dominance, but what we can't do is come into rational agreement. And really, and stop in the make-believe, just for a moment. Ask yourself, do you really think that today our culture has the ability to rationally resolve the most fundamental disagreements over values? If so, well, keep reading the book or keep watching. And I think MacIntyre will show you that even if there is some basic raw aversion to killing that we all share, the moral debates of the 20th century show that we don't even agree on what counts as murder. And so, given that we're rational and political animals, the inability to speak to one another and reason intelligibly about these matters is a serious problem, right? Even if we're not entirely without moral convictions. So, what resources for recovering a coherent moral vision do we have? All right, so the bad news, our conceptual framework is fragmentary. Well, now I want to know, well, where do I go? Right? I want a coherent moral framework. Where do I go? And you're telling me that the moral sensibilities aren't enough. Something else is needed to impose order on them and show what direction they need to be developed. And that means there has to be an outside source of coherency that we impose upon them. So where do we find this source of order and coherency in real human life? And notice, and especially if you've already become a fan of MacIntyre, this is really important because he's got to be careful here. MacIntyre can't just say that it's all just in the lost moral theories. He can't say that. Because then we could ask, well, where did those moral theories start from, right? What was the starting point for the first of those theories that he apparently loves so much, right? See what I mean? It can't be an endless regress of theory. So there has to be some original source, okay, in human experience from which the lost moral theories began. Well, what was that original source? Take me there. That's where I need to go, right? That's where we have to go if we want to begin the process of developing a moral framework all over again. Well, later in the book, MacIntyre will identify not one, not two, but three sources. So first, MacIntyre will note that central to much of human life are activities that we perform that admit of excellence. And often these excellent activities are tied to the various roles we inhabit in life together with others. So think, for example, of a skilled carpenter and all the activities that go into building a house. Now, these kinds of activities and roles bind us together in relations of mutual dependence, and so they're a source of prosperity and social affiliation. But beyond that, performing these activities well, according to standards of excellence, makes a particular sort of good available to the practitioner, to the carpenter, apart from any of the money or honor the carpenter might receive for his work. These goods internal to a practice figure heavily in the good life. Second, MacIntyre will argue that the form of a human life, on the whole, is one characterized by progressing through various conflicts. And these conflicts are not incidental to human life, but rather they provide it with its essential structure. Okay? These conflicts give human life a fundamental direction, or telos. And that means a human life can end in either victory or defeat. Thus, human life has a distinctive narrative form and a telos at which it aims. And so a major problem with current and modern moral theories is that their fragments make no intelligent use of the two ideas above, right? And this leads us to the third and final source, tradition. As humans pursue excellence in activity and move through the conflicts of life towards their individual fates, we do so together in social groups that share fundamental convictions about both human excellence and the ultimate human purpose. And over time, these groups accumulate insight and wisdom about human excellence and human telos, and they pass it down. This is the idea of a tradition. And those humans with a long and successful tradition have many advantages over humans that are just kind of starting from the beginning. Hence, if you're in Western Civ, then you need to look to your own tradition. Throughout the book, we'll see that MacIntyre does not think that the confusion is spread evenly among those of us even in the West. The culture as a whole suffers confusion, but there are sources among us that predate the confusion, and some of us can draw upon that classical tradition. Institutions like the Roman Catholic Church and documents like the Bible are older than the catastrophe. And so those among us who are even partially formed by these sources, we have a foot in the pre-catastrophe world. And that means we have a leg up on those who have no formation by the tradition. Those people most thoroughly modernized will have the most fragmentary conceptions of the moral life. And we'll see this as we move through the book, what that means. But for now, if you know the work of Jonathan Haidt and what he calls weird morality, okay, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, then that'll get you pretty much on the right track to understanding where most of the confusion lies. Okay, so I think I've now talked for more than half an hour about probably the first 4 pages of MacIntyre's book. If you're interested in seeing where he goes and learning more about virtue, hit subscribe.